Sergeant Maria Vasquez had always been the quiet one in Bravo Company. While the other soldiers cleaned their rifles and practiced tactical maneuvers, she could be found reorganizing her medical kit for the 100th time. Checking expiration dates on morphine auto-injectors and studying field surgery techniques from a worn paperback manual, her fellow soldiers respected her. But they saw her as the person who would patch them up, not the one who would fight alongside them when things got serious. The forward operating base in the remote valley had been Maria's home for 8 months. Dust coated everything here, from the makeshift medical tent where she spent her days to the metal containers that served as their living quarters. The mountains surrounding them held secrets that none of them fully understood. And every patrol that went out carried the possibility of not coming back the same way they left. Maria had joined the army straight out of high school in a small town in Texas. Her mother had been a nurse, and her father had served 2 tours in Vietnam. Military service felt like a natural path. But she had always gravitated toward healing rather than fighting. During basic training, when other recruits struggled with weapons handling, Maria excelled in field medicine courses. She could start an IV line in complete darkness, perform emergency surgery with improvised tools, and keep a wounded soldier calm while under fire. The soldiers in her unit had learned to trust her completely. Private Johnson, barely 19 and far from home, would come to her tent when nightmares kept him awake. Corporal Martinez brought her pictures of his newborn daughter and asked for advice about being a father while deployed. Staff Sergeant Williams, a veteran of 3 deployments, relied on her to keep the younger soldiers mentally and physically healthy, but Maria carried a secret that none of them knew. Before enlisting, she had spent 2 years at a shooting range back home, learning marksmanship from her grandfather, who had been a competitive shooter. Her grandfather had taught her that shooting was about patience, breathing, and understanding the weapon as an extension of yourself. She could place shots with remarkable precision, but she had never mentioned this skill to anyone in her unit. Her job was to save lives, not take them. The operating base sat at the mouth of a valley that served as a crucial supply route. Intelligence reports suggested that enemy forces were planning something significant, but the exact nature of the threat remained unclear. For weeks, patrols had reported unusual activity in the surrounding mountains. Local villagers had evacuated the area, and radio chatter indicated that hostile forces were positioning themselves for a major assault. Captain Rodriguez had briefed the company about increased threat levels, but life on the base continued with its usual routine. Morning formations, equipment maintenance, patrol rotations, and the endless paperwork that seemed to follow every military operation. Maria spent her days treating everything from minor cuts and bruises to more serious injuries from improvised explosive devices encountered during patrols. The medical tent where she worked was located near the center of the base, close enough to the helicopter landing zone for medical evacuations, but protected by several layers of defensive positions. She had set up her workspace with the efficiency of someone who understood that seconds could mean the difference between life and death. Surgical instruments were arranged in precise order, medications were clearly labeled and easily accessible, and emergency equipment was tested daily. During quiet moments, Maria would sometimes watch the perimeter guards through the tent opening. They moved with practiced alertness, scanning the ridgelines and monitoring radio communications. She respected their dedication, but she also noticed things that others might miss. The way certain guards favored one side while walking, suggesting old injuries that might slow them down. The positions that offered the best fields of fire versus those that provided the most protection. The blind spots where an attacker might approach, undetected. Her medical training had taught her to observe details, to notice changes in vital signs or behavior that might indicate serious problems. These same skills made her acutely aware of the tactical situation around the base. She could see that their defensive positions, while adequate for normal threats, might not hold against a coordinated assault by a determined enemy force. 3 days before everything changed, a patrol had brought back a wounded Afghan National Army soldier who had been found near the valley entrance. The man was unconscious and severely dehydrated, with wounds that suggested he had been tortured before being left to die. Maria worked for hours to stabilize him, but he died before regaining consciousness. Among his personal effects, they found a hand-drawn map showing detailed positions of the base defenses. The discovery of the map confirmed everyone's worst fears. The enemy had been conducting reconnaissance and planning a specific attack on their position. Captain Rodriguez immediately ordered increased patrols and reinforced defensive positions. But Maria could see the strain on the soldiers' faces. They were outnumbered and far from reinforcements, holding a position that had become increasingly dangerous. That evening, as Maria cleaned and reorganized her medical supplies, she made a decision that would haunt her for years to come. She retrieved a rifle from the arms room, claiming she wanted to familiarize herself with defensive procedures in case the medical tent came under direct attack. The weapon felt familiar in her hands, awakening muscle memory from those long afternoons at the shooting range with her grandfather. She spent that night on the roof of the medical tent, supposedly watching for threats, but actually studying the approaches to the base and calculating distances and angles. The precision rifle scope revealed details that were invisible to the naked eye. She could see movement in the mountains, the glint of metal that suggested enemy positions, and the paths that attackers would most likely use to approach their defenses. The next morning, Maria noticed that several of the regular perimeter guards seemed unusually nervous. Private Chen, who usually joked and laughed during his shifts, was quiet and kept checking his ammunition. Sergeant Brooks, normally calm under pressure, was chain-smoking cigarettes and constantly adjusting his radio. Even Staff Sergeant Williams appeared tense, spending extra time inspecting defensive positions and talking quietly with the other squad leaders. Maria realized that the intelligence about an impending attack was more specific than she had been told. The enemy was coming, probably soon, and everyone except the medical personnel had been briefed about the severity of the threat. She felt a mixture of frustration and understanding. Medical personnel were typically kept out of tactical planning to allow them to focus on their humanitarian mission. But this separation also meant she was unprepared for what was about to happen. That afternoon, she approached Captain Rodriguez and requested permission to establish a secondary medical station closer to the perimeter. She explained that if casualties were heavy, having medical support closer to the fighting might save lives by reducing evacuation time. The captain approved her request, not realizing that Maria had chosen a position that also provided an excellent vantage point for precision shooting. As the sun began to set on what would be their last normal day, Maria made final preparations. She moved essential medical supplies to the forward position, but she also positioned the rifle where it could be quickly accessed. She studied the approach routes one more time, memorizing distances and identifying the most likely positions where enemy shooters would establish themselves. The base settled into its nighttime routine, but there was an underlying tension that everyone could feel. Radio chatter was more frequent than usual, and the perimeter guards moved with extra alertness. Maria lay in her sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling of her tent, knowing that tomorrow would change everything. She had trained to save lives, but circumstances were about to force her into a role she had never imagined she would need to fill. The attack began at 4:37 in the morning, just as the sky was beginning to show the first hints of dawn. Maria was awakened not by the sound of gunfire, but by the sudden silence that fell over the base when all the normal nighttime sounds stopped at once. In her experience, complete silence often preceded disaster. The first explosion shattered the quiet like thunder, followed immediately by automatic weapons fire from multiple directions. Maria rolled out of her sleeping bag and grabbed her helmet and body armor, her medical training taking over as she prepared to treat casualties. But as she moved toward the primary medical tent, a second explosion much closer to her position made her realize that this was not a typical probe or harassment attack. Through the tent opening, she could see muzzle flashes from the ridgelines surrounding the base. The enemy had positioned shooters in elevated positions that gave them clear fields of fire into the compound. Tracer rounds streaked through the darkness like deadly fireworks, and the distinctive sound of incoming mortar rounds whistled overhead. Maria reached the forward medical position she had established the day before, expecting to find wounded soldiers being brought for treatment. Instead, she found chaos. Private Chen was dragging Sergeant Brooks toward her position, both men bleeding from shrapnel wounds. Behind them, she could see that two of the main defensive positions had been overrun, and enemy fighters were moving through the perimeter. "Doc, we need to fall back to the main compound," Chen shouted over the noise of battle. They broke through the north wall, and they're inside the wire. Maria began treating Brooke's wounds while scanning the tactical situation. What she saw filled her with cold dread. The carefully planned defensive positions were collapsing faster than anyone had anticipated. The enemy had somehow neutralized the perimeter guards silently before beginning the main assault, giving them crucial time to position themselves inside the base defenses. A burst of automatic fire very close to their position sent all three of them diving for cover. When Maria looked up, she saw an enemy fighter moving between two containers, heading directly toward the main medical tent where several wounded soldiers were receiving treatment. The fighter carried an assault rifle and moved with the confidence of someone who knew the base layout intimately. In that moment, Maria faced a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could continue in her role as a medic, focusing on treating the wounded and hoping that the remaining defenders could stop the attack. Or she could act on the tactical training that she had absorbed through months of observation and her hidden marksmanship skills. The decision was made for her when the enemy fighter raised his weapon toward the medical tent. Maria grabbed the precision rifle she had positioned nearby and moved to a shooting position behind a concrete barrier. Her grandfather's training took over completely. Control your breathing. Steady the weapon. Find your natural point of aim. Squeeze the trigger smoothly. The rifle fired once, and the enemy fighter dropped immediately. The shot was perfect, striking the target center mass from a distance of nearly 200 meters in poor lighting conditions. Maria felt no satisfaction. Only the grim realization that she had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. But there was no time for reflection. More enemy fighters were moving through the compound, and the defensive positions continued to collapse. Maria could see that Captain Rodriguez was trying to coordinate a counterattack from the command post, but he was pinned down by fire from multiple directions. She moved to a better position that gave her a clear view of the helicopter landing zone, where several enemy fighters were attempting to destroy the aircraft that would be needed for medical evacuation. Her next shot disabled the fighter preparing to throw a grenade into the helicopter, and her third shot stopped another enemy who was setting up a machine gun position. The transformation was complete and terrible. Maria's medical training had taught her exactly where to place shots for maximum effectiveness, and her marksmanship skills allowed her to engage targets with deadly precision. She understood human anatomy better than most soldiers understood their weapons, and this knowledge made her shooting devastatingly accurate. Over the course of the next 2 hours, as dawn slowly illuminated the battlefield, Maria found herself in a deadly game of hide-and-seek with enemy forces, who had begun to realize that someone was systematically eliminating their fighters with precision shots. She would fire once or twice from a position, then move before return fire could locate her. Her medical kit remained with her throughout the fighting, and she continued to treat wounded soldiers when possible. But increasingly, her primary contribution to the battle was through the precision rifle that had become an extension of her will to protect her fellow soldiers. Staff Sergeant Williams found her during a brief lull in the fighting, crouched behind a damaged vehicle while reloading the rifle. His expression showed a mixture of amazement and concern. "Doc, where the hell did you learn to shoot like that?" he asked. "My grandfather taught me," Maria replied, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "But I never wanted to use it like this." Williams nodded, understanding immediately. Combat had a way of forcing people to discover capabilities they never knew they possessed, or never wanted to discover. The tide of the battle began to turn, as Maria's precision shooting eliminated key enemy positions and allowed the remaining defenders to reorganize their counterattack. Each shot she fired was calculated not just for immediate effect, but for tactical impact on the overall battle. She targeted enemy machine gunners first, then radio operators, then leaders who were attempting to coordinate attacks. By the time helicopter gunships arrived to provide air support, Maria had fired 43 rounds and achieved 41 confirmed targets. The enemy force, originally estimated at over 60 fighters, had been reduced to scattered groups that were quickly eliminated by the reorganized base defenders and air support. As the last of the gunfire faded and medical helicopters began landing to evacuate the wounded, Maria sat beside her rifle and tried to process what had happened. She had saved lives through her medical work, but she had also taken lives with a precision and efficiency that surprised even herself. Captain Rodriguez approached her position as she was cleaning the rifle with the same methodical care she used for her medical instruments. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen before, a mixture of respect and something that might have been concern. "Sergeant Vasquez," he said formally, "I need to understand what happened here. According to the other soldiers, you single-handedly turned this battle around." Maria looked up from the rifle, meeting his gaze directly. "I did what was necessary to protect my patients and my fellow soldiers, sir." The captain nodded slowly. "I'm going to recommend you for a Silver Star. But I'm also going to recommend that you receive counseling support. What you did today was extraordinary, but it was also something that no medic should have to do." As the evacuation helicopters lifted off carrying the wounded, Maria realized that her war had fundamentally changed. She would continue to serve as a medic, but she would never again be seen simply as someone who healed wounds. She had become something else, entirely, something that her fellow soldiers would both rely on and be slightly afraid of. The enemy had made a fatal mistake in their intelligence. They had identified her as a non-combatant medical personnel and had not considered her a threat. This miscalculation had cost them the battle and possibly the entire operation in the valley. But it had also cost Maria something that she could never recover: the innocence of believing that her role in war would be limited to healing rather than harming.